It's like I'm wearing the cat ears for a game. Was I ever considering making T3-4 NexusTANKIer? Possibly. Here's the thing though. Something we want to avoid is something called trapped games. Trapped games is where you are guaranteed to lose the game, but the game isn't ending. Those suck because you basically create a situation where a bunch of players are in a game that should end and isn't for whatever reason. It's very different, by the way, than a game that someone could come back. Like, I'm not talking about games where you're losing and you can come back. I'm talking about games where you are losing and will not come back, but for whatever reason, the enemy is going to take another 10, 20 minutes to end the game. And so, one of the reasons that we don't make towers giga tanky, you know, there's always some amount of tankiness they need versus squishiness, but one of the reasons to make Nexus towers not as tanky as you perhaps would desire is if the enemy team is at your Nexus towers, it very often indicates a game state where the game should probably end soon. And so making it very, very hard to take your Nexus towers could result in a situation where the game becomes much harder to end and games become more trapped. Why did you remove SKARNER's old passive? It was a good idea on paper. It adds a lot of map control and new objectives, and while the new passive is more reliable, it's way less cool. I would argue SKARNER's old passive was a very bad idea on paper, actually. I don't think it was a good passive, and I'm glad it's not in the game. And the reason for that is SKARNER's passive requires everybody else in the game to play Capture the Flag. And I think that's not something that most champions should do, is have spells on their kit that say, now everybody else has to play this minigame. I think that's fairly... There's a spell like that that requires everybody on every team to play a minigame, like SKARNER's old passive with the Spires did. I think it has a very big threshold for being worth it, basically. Like, it has to be really, 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 really good to be worth it to have it in the game. And in the case of old SKARNER's passive, I don't think it reached that bar. It was like, hey, you're good in certain areas. For a lot of SKARNER players, I would argue that felt like a punishment. And what I mean by that is SKARNER's good in certain areas. Cool. You know where Nocturne is good? All the areas. You know where Vi is good? All the areas. Right? And so I think one of the things that was rough about SKARNER's Spires is you have to play a mini game to get them. And the result is, yes, you are strong in this area, but you are not, like, insanely strong. You're not like, wow, now I'm Kale in this area. No, it's just, you're, like, kind of, like, slightly above base level. And so I think the end result of that passive was everybody had to play in a mini game for an effect that ended up in a number of times making SKARNER feel like he had to jump through hoops that no one else had to jump through. So that's kind of my thought about that. What about Kindred's marks? I think Kindred marks are much less of a mini game because Kindred marks are like natural gameplay. What I mean by that is, yes, don't let Kindred get the mark, duh, but you're already supposed to not let her steal your jungle. You're already supposed to not let her kill you, right? And so while there is a mini game present, the changes in gameplay that it requires are significantly less than something like SKARNER's passive. Because it's keying on to gameplay you're already doing naturally, which is don't let people take these camps and take your life. And then additionally, Kindred's reward for playing that minigame is pretty substantial. Kindred gets a ton of range, a ton of power for playing that minigame. And so I think that minigame ends up feeling for Kindred and for her teammates and for her enemies, just everybody involved, significantly more worth it to engage in as well. Because the result of it is incredibly transformational and powerful. Found out that Riot removed the stats tab. Was there any reason to remove it, resources-wise? It is probably because it wasn't used. Any feature that you have in the game tends to need upkeep cost, especially in concerns to Riot. Riot doesn't tend to upkeep a lot of the things we do, except for, like, you know, the mainline stuff like game balance and, you know, there's a lot of things we do upkeep, but a lot of things you know, just don't have the resources to be constantly upkeeped in a perfect way. And so there's a question when any like feature goes in of like how many people are using it, how many people care about it, how valuable is it? And if it's not impacting all that many players and players aren't using it, then there ends up not being very much of a justification to keep it. What does sudden impact not have a UI for CD? It's not valuable to create a UI for something that doesn't change your gameplay, right? So does sudden impact have a UI, have a CD? Yes. Would it really matter at all, given it kind of just happens in the course of your natural gameplay pattern and honestly doesn't add that much damage, right? And so the thing is like there's a lot of runes that yes, we could give them UI, yes, we could give them icons, but the amount of power in the runes is not really worth the UI space they take up. So Sudden's Impact's an example of something that like, yes, you could have just permanent icons constantly ticking on your character, showing you when it's up and when it's coming down and things like that, but like, that's not really worth displaying for the amount of gameplay power it has and for the amount of change that most players would ever do to their gameplay to take advantage of it. Why do we remove Rock Solid? I couldn't give you context on it, I don't really know. I would say that I would argue that one of the problems I've always had with Rock Solid, this is not the reason it is removed if it was removed. Again, I'm not in the office, I don't know the reasonings. One of the problems I've always had with Rock Solid is that Rock Solid, compared to the old thing those items used to do, which was lower the attack speed, Rock Solid is not nearly as good as against the characters you want it to be good against. Specifically characters like Vayne or Kaisa, who are loading a lot of their power into on-hit effects. And so one of the things I always had problems with Rock Solid is that Rock Solid lies to you a little bit, and it's like, hey, I'm really good against auto attackers. And then it's like, it's not that it's false, it is good against auto attackers, but the auto attackers it's good against are not necessarily the ones you want it to be good against. That's always been my, like, I guess, bit of salt about how Rock Solid works. I don't understand why in 2024 Riot is still not allowing us to unbind the zoom camera. All I will say about that is a lot of things to do with the settings and key bindings that you think would be easy are actually very hard and take a lot of engineering. As an example of this, we almost didn't have key bindings in Swarm, which would have sucked, by the way. It would have been super lame. But letting people choose how to bind their keys in Swarm was something we almost had to just accept that we wouldn't be able to do. Because it took a very real amount of engineering time to allow for letting players set new key bindings for the new space that Swarm with like the different buttons and the WASD that it required, things like that. It just turns out that like some things in League of Legends, especially since the game is so old, were created in ways that are somewhat inflexible. And so I don't have any context on whether zooming in and out and being able to bind it, unbinding it is inflexible or not. But all I will say is that when you're thinking about why a game hasn't done something that seems easy, very often, not always, but often, the reason is because it's a lot harder than you think under the hood. That's been my learning working on League.